What does it mean when an object survives its own explanation? Imagine a museum after closing time. The lights have dimmed, footsteps are gone. Behind the glass, a handful of ancient things remain awake in the silence. A corroded mechanism, a sealed jar, a fragment of stone cut too cleanly, a map that seems to remember a world no one should have known. They do not speak, and yet each one presses the same quiet question against the mind. Are we looking at relics of progress, or at the ruins of something history failed to carry forward? We like to believe the human story moves in a straight line. First darkness, then fire. First superstition, then reason. First crude tools, then elegant machines. It is a comforting shape, this upward arc. It gives time a direction and civilization a purpose. But every so often, something surfaces from the earth or the sea that does not fit the pattern. Not enough to overturn the past in an instant, but enough to trouble it. These objects are often described as anomalies, curiosities, mistakes in the filing cabinet of history. Yet that language may reveal more about us than about them. We are uneasy with reminders that knowledge can vanish, that discovery can be forgotten, that memory itself is not a perfect archive. A culture can build wonders and still lose the meaning of its own hands. This is a story about those unsettling survivors. Not proof of fantasy, and not an argument for certainty, but a journey through the narrow space between evidence and interpretation. A place where wonder must remain disciplined and doubt must remain humane. Because sometimes the most mysterious thing is not the object we uncover. It is the story we were so sure we already knew. It began, as many mysteries do, at the bottom of the sea. In the spring of 1900, sponge divers sheltering from a storm near a small Greek island descended into clear water and found what looked, at first glance, like a graveyard. Bronze limbs, stone faces, fragments of horses and men lay scattered across the seafloor beside the remains of an ancient ship. The cargo had slept there for nearly 2,000 years, preserved by darkness, salt, and time. It was the kind of discovery that seemed to confirm what people already loved about antiquity: beauty, tragedy, and loss. Then someone noticed the gears. They were small, green with corrosion, fused into a lump so unremarkable it might easily have been ignored. But once cleaned and studied, the fragment began to reveal an astonishing interior world. Teeth interlocked with teeth, circular scales hid inside circular scales. What emerged was not merely decoration or ritual craftsmanship. It was a machine, a device from the ancient Mediterranean capable of modeling cycles in the sky, tracking celestial motions with a precision that felt uncannily modern. For years, scholars struggled even to describe it without sounding extravagant. We are accustomed to placing delicate computation in the age of clocks, observatories, and industry. But here, inside an artifact built by hands long turned to dust, was evidence that sophisticated mechanical thinking had flourished far earlier than most histories once allowed. Not magic, not impossibility. Something perhaps more moving than either: forgotten ingenuity. The mechanism did not rewrite the ancient world into a fantasy of advanced perfection. It did something subtler. It reminded us that intelligence does not belong to one century alone. Human beings, even in distant eras, were capable of abstraction, patience, and breathtaking precision. The stars above them were the same stars above us. Their desire to measure them feels deeply familiar. And maybe that is what lingers most. How many achievements disappear, not because they were impossible, but because time is less faithful than we hope? A map is never just a map. It is a confession of what a people believe the world to be. Centuries ago, in rooms lit by candles and disciplined by ink, cartographers tried to give shape to a planet still larger than certainty. Coastlines were rumors made visible. Mountains rose from hearsay. Oceans carried not only ships, but speculation. And yet among these careful approximations, a few images appeared that continue to unsettle the modern eye. Outlines of lands drawn with a confidence that seems at first glance to exceed the knowledge of their time. One such chart has inspired generations of fascination. Its surviving fragments show familiar shores, but also forms that seem strangely ahead of the age that produced them. To some, this suggests hidden voyages, lost archives, or chains of knowledge passed hand to hand across collapsing empires. To others, the explanation is more sober. Distortions, coincidences, the human tendency to see precision where there is only resemblance. Both responses tell us something important. We are not only reading an old map, we are reading our own hunger for coherence. Still, the mystery endures because maps sit at the edge of imagination and measurement. They are practical tools, yes, but they are also acts of longing. Every line on parchment declares that the unknown can be approached, named, maybe even understood. When later generations discover traces that seem improbably accurate, the effect is almost intimate. We glimpse minds from long ago reaching farther than we expected. Perhaps that is why these documents feel so moving. They remind us that history is not populated by simple people waiting for modernity to arrive. It is filled with observers, guessers, sailors, scholars, men and women trying, with incomplete information, to hold the world still long enough to draw it. And what if the real wonder is not that some maps seem too advanced? What if it is that human beings have always been trying to picture horizons they had not yet touched? Sometimes the mystery is small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. A battery, by modern definition, seems almost ordinary. A quiet object, a sealed container holding the promise of stored energy. We associate it with flashlights, radios, watches, the discrete machinery of daily life. So when archaeologists uncovered clay jars containing copper cylinders and iron rods, the temptation was immediate. Had an ancient people stumbled onto electricity long before the modern age named it? The objects themselves were humble, even fragile. No dramatic gleam announced their importance, yet their structure invited comparison. If filled with an acidic liquid, they might produce a small electrical charge. That possibility was enough to ignite decades of fascination. Here, perhaps, was evidence not simply of craft, but of experiment, a forgotten brush against one of nature's most elusive forces. And still, the truth remains suspended between plausibility and restraint. Some researchers have suggested practical uses: electroplating, ritual performance, medicinal effect, or simple curiosity. Others caution that resemblance is not proof. Ancient artifacts often acquire modern identities too quickly, especially when their original context is incomplete. A jar can resemble a battery without ever having served as one. The past deserves imagination, but it also deserves discipline. Yet even uncertainty has its own kind of meaning. These vessels matter not only because of what they may have done, but because of what they reveal about our relationship with history. We want ancient people to surprise us, and they often do. But the deeper surprise may be that innovation does not always arrive as a finished revolution. Sometimes it appears as fragments, half-understood processes, experiments without legacy, sparks that never became a system. Human knowledge is not a straight highway. It is more like a field crossed by many paths, some worn deep, others lost under wind and sand. And when we find an object that seems to flicker with possibility, we are left with a haunting question. How many discoveries were made once, quietly, and then allowed to go dark? There are moments when stone seems to argue with time. Deep in ancient sites, beneath dust and collapsed earth, archaeologists sometimes uncover surfaces so precisely worked that they feel almost contemporary. A wall joint with no room for a blade, a drilled opening too smooth to seem casual, a polished plane cut into material hard enough to resist even confident tools. Standing before such objects, the modern eye instinctively reaches for familiar language: machining, engineering, calibration. We recognize the signature of care, and it unsettles us when it appears too early. One of the most enduring mysteries in this realm is not a single object, but a pattern. Across different civilizations, there are stones shaped with a discipline that suggests remarkable skill and knowledge of materials. Granite, basalt, diorite, surfaces resistant, unforgiving, slow to yield. And yet they were carved, fitted, and finished with a patience that can still command awe. Were these feats the result of lost methods, exceptional labor, or forms of craftsmanship we have simply underestimated? That question matters because modern people are often tempted by two extremes. Either ancient builders are reduced to primitive effort, as if intelligence only arrived recently, or they are transformed into something mythic and unreachable. The truth may be more challenging than either fantasy. Human beings, working within the limits of their age, can achieve astonishing things when knowledge, necessity, and devotion converge over generations. Precision does not always require modern machinery. Sometimes it requires time, repetition, and minds trained to notice what others would miss. Still, the stones remain quietly provocative. They do not let us settle too easily into simple narratives of progress. They remind us that technical mastery can flourish in worlds very different from our own, and that sophistication often survives longest in silence. A polished surface on an ancient block is more than evidence of technique. It is a message from unknown hands, asking whether we mistake unfamiliar methods for impossible ones simply because we no longer remember how patience itself can become a technology. What can a lens remember that a civilization forgets? In a museum drawer or a catalog photograph, a small crystal object can look almost insignificant. It does not command attention the way a monument does. It does not arrive with the authority of a temple, a shipwreck, or a royal tomb. And yet some of the most provocative artifacts in history are precisely these modest pieces, curved, polished, mathematically quiet, objects that seem to suggest an intimacy with light long before we expect it. Among them are ancient lenses, pieces of worked crystal or glass that may have magnified, focused, or clarified the world in subtle ways. Their exact purpose is often debated. Were they tools for artisans working fine details, decorative objects, simple curiosities? Or did they serve as early optical instruments, revealing that people in the distant past had a more practical relationship with magnification than our textbooks once assumed? The question matters because vision is never only biological. It is cultural. To shape light is to extend perception, and to extend perception is to alter what a society can know. A polished lens, however simple, hints at more than craft. It hints at attention. Someone noticed that the world could be sharpened. Someone discovered that a transparent curve could change reality without changing the object being seen. That insight feels profoundly modern, yet it may be ancient in ways we still underestimate. Not because the past secretly possessed all the tools of the present, but because human curiosity has always leaned toward the invisible edge of things. People have long searched for ways to see more clearly, farther into the sky, deeper into matter, closer into the hidden detail of ordinary life. Even if these lenses were used only in limited or practical ways, their existence carries a quiet force. They remind us that discovery does not always announce itself as a revolution. Sometimes it begins with a slight distortion in crystal, a hand held up to the light, a moment of surprise. And from that moment comes a question that echoes across centuries. How much of history changed simply because someone somewhere found a better way to look? It is one thing to inherit knowledge. It is another to bury it with the dead. Across deserts and valleys, inside tombs sealed against weather and memory, archaeologists have found objects that feel strangely technical for the worlds that held them. Delicate instruments, measured markings, crafted metals, devices whose purpose seems to hover between ritual and utility. In burial sites especially, these discoveries take on an added emotional weight. They were not discarded, they were chosen, carried across the threshold between life and death as if their value extended beyond ordinary use. This is where mystery becomes deeply human. A tool placed in a grave tells us that knowledge was not merely functional, it was meaningful. It belonged to identity, status, vocation, perhaps even belief. A craftsman's instrument, a physician's implement, a navigator's aid, such things suggest that technical understanding was woven into daily life more intimately than we sometimes imagine. Ancient societies did not divide the practical from the spiritual as neatly as we do. An object could heal, measure, symbolize, and protect all at once. That layered significance complicates the modern search for explanation. We want a clean answer. What was it for? But the past often resists that simplicity. An artifact may have served many purposes across many years. It may have passed through different hands, collected different meanings. By the time it was placed in a tomb, it might already have become something more than a tool. It might have become memory itself. And so these discoveries invite a gentler form of interpretation. Not every mystery needs to become a miracle. Sometimes an object feels advanced because it came from a life richer and more complex than our stereotypes allow. The ancient world was filled with specialists, observers, inventors, and keepers of skilled traditions. Their work did not vanish because it lacked value. Sometimes it vanished because the chain of teaching was broken. A tomb, then, is not only a place of endings, it is also a reminder that when a person disappears, an entire library of lived knowledge may disappear with them, unless something small, durable, and enigmatic is left behind to speak in their place. The earth does not give up its secrets all at once. It releases them in fragments, and sometimes in the wrong order. A miner breaks into stone and finds something impossible looking sealed inside. A collector opens a rock and discovers the shape of a tool, a thread, a pattern that seems to belong to a different age. These stories travel quickly because they disturb more than chronology. They disturb trust. If the layers of the world can hold objects that appear misplaced, then the reassuring sequence of before and after begins to tremble. But geology, like memory, is rarely simple at first glance. Many such discoveries arrive stripped of context. The original site is poorly documented. The object passes through private hands. The stone that supposedly enclosed it is broken apart before careful study can occur. What remains is a tale balanced between possibility and caution. Some cases later find ordinary explanations: intrusion, contamination, misidentification, a modern object caught in an older setting. Others remain unresolved not because they defy science, but because the chain of evidence is too thin to carry certainty. And yet the fascination persists for good reason. These stories force us to confront how much interpretation depends on context. An object by itself is only part of the truth. Where it was found, how it was embedded, who handled it, what assumptions guided the first observer. These details matter as much as the artifact. Without them, history can become vulnerable to both error and fantasy. Still, there is something valuable in the unease such cases produce. They remind us that knowledge is not only about discovery, it is about method. The discipline to ask how we know is just as important as the thrill of what we think we have found. In that sense, even doubtful objects teach us something enduring. They reveal how fragile certainty can be. And perhaps that is why misplaced artifacts linger in the imagination. Not because they prove the past was stranger than we thought, but because they expose how easily the story of time can be bent when evidence arrives without its voice. There are times when the past feels less like a sequence and more like an echo. Consider the crafts that seem to appear, vanish, and then return centuries later under new names. A pigment no one can easily recreate, a glass that resists decay, a metal worked with such refinement that modern observers pause before calling it ancient. These are not always singular miracles. Often they are remnants of traditions, complex, fragile systems of knowledge carried by apprenticeship, habit, and local memory. When those systems break, the result can look, from a distance, like mystery. This may be one of the great misunderstandings in how we imagine progress. We tend to think of invention as permanent, as though once humanity learns a thing, that knowledge simply enters the bloodstream of history and stays there. But cultures do not store memory perfectly. Empires collapse, trade routes fail, languages disappear, workshops burn, teachers die before passing on what their hands know. Under those conditions, even ordinary expertise can become extraordinary in hindsight. An object from the wrong time period may therefore be wrong only in relation to our expectations. What unsettles us is not always the thing itself, but the possibility that history has gaps wide enough to swallow mastery. A skill can peak, disappear, and later be rediscovered without any conspiracy at all. What feels advanced may simply be the surviving edge of a lost continuum. That realization carries a certain melancholy. It suggests that civilizations are not only measured by what they create, but by what they manage to preserve. Memory is a form of infrastructure. When it fails, the future inherits fragments and calls them anomalies. And yet, there is also hope in this pattern, because every recovered technique, every re-examined artifact, every overlooked detail brought back into view tells us that human brilliance is rarely extinguished completely. It leaves traces. It waits in objects, in ruins, in recipes, in marks on stone and metal, until someone with patience is willing to look again. Maybe the past is not hiding from us. Maybe it is asking whether we understand how often wisdom survives only as a remainder. What do we do with evidence that refuses to become a conclusion? By this point in the journey, the pattern is familiar. An object emerges from sand, sea, or stone. It carries the texture of another era, yet seems to speak in a language we thought belonged to a later age. Experts examine it. The public imagines beyond it. Between those two responses lies a complicated space, one filled with caution, desire, and the burden of interpretation. This is where the story becomes less about artifacts and more about us. We are meaning-making creatures, faced with an unexplained mechanism, an unfamiliar map, a polished lens, or a strangely precise carving. We instinctively build narratives to contain our discomfort. Some narratives lean toward dismissal, others lean toward extravagance, but both can flatten the deeper truth. That uncertainty is not failure. It is often the most honest form of contact with the past. To live with uncertainty requires maturity. It asks us to resist the seduction of easy answers, especially when mystery is involved. Not every anomaly is proof of hidden civilizations or impossible technologies, but neither should every puzzle be filed away simply because it disturbs established timelines. The real task is harder and more human. It is to remain open without becoming careless, to be skeptical without becoming numb, to let evidence lead even when it leads only to a better question. In that sense, these objects perform a quiet service. They slow us down. They remind us that history is not a courtroom where every case reaches a verdict. Sometimes it is a conversation across damaged distances, with missing pages and altered voices. The goal is not always certainty. Sometimes it is humility, and humility may be the most valuable discovery of all. Because when an object survives its explanation, it asks us to become better listeners to the material world, to the limits of our knowledge, and to the possibility that the past is not a solved story, but a living field of wonder still being read. There is a particular loneliness in being the first person to touch an object after 1,000 years. Imagine the brush moving gently across packed soil. A contour appears, then an edge, then something unmistakably made by human intention. In that instant, time folds. The archaeologist kneeling in dust is no longer separated from the maker by centuries of abstraction, but connected by pressure, angle, material, design. Discovery is often described as triumph. Just as often it is recognition. That feeling matters because impossible objects are rarely impossible in isolation. They become extraordinary through encounter. A scholar notices a pattern others overlooked. A conservator sees engineering in corrosion. A diver lifts a fragment from the sea and carries with it a question no one expected to ask. These are not only stories about ancient intelligence, they are also stories about modern attention, about the fragile, patient act of learning to see what is already there. And seeing is never neutral. Every generation interprets the past through its own tools, anxieties, and ambitions. The industrial age looked for machines, the electrical age looked for circuits. The digital age looks for computation, networks, hidden systems. We do not simply uncover artifacts, we meet them with metaphors shaped by our own time. Sometimes those metaphors illuminate, sometimes they distort. The challenge is not to escape perspective entirely, but to become conscious of it. This makes the work of interpretation strangely intimate. To study an ancient object is also to examine the frame of mind we bring to it. Why does one fragment inspire reverence while another invites skepticism? Why do some mysteries become famous while others remain in drawers, mislabeled and quiet? The answers tell us as much about cultural desire as they do about historical fact. Perhaps that is why these objects endure in memory. They are not only remnants of lost worlds, they are mirrors. In trying to understand what earlier people knew, feared, or made possible, we reveal the shape of our own curiosity and the measure of how willing we are to let wonder remain unresolved. What if the greatest hidden history is not a lost empire, but the ordinary fragility of knowledge itself? By now, the objects have begun to gather into something larger than a catalog of curiosities. A mechanism from the sea, a map that stretches expectation, a vessel that may or may not have carried a spark, stones shaped with unnerving precision, crystal that bends light, tools buried with the dead, fragments found out of sequence. Together, they suggest a truth both less sensational and more profound than fantasy. Human understanding has always been vulnerable to interruption. We inherit the past in uneven pieces. Some civilizations leave libraries. Others leave walls, roads, pigments, metalwork, bones. And sometimes what survives is not the center of a culture, but its edges, the accidental remainder of a much wider world of practice. A single artifact may be all that is left of an entire tradition of teaching, experimentation, and craft. That is why an object can feel strangely advanced. It is not necessarily ahead of its time. It may be the last visible trace of a time that was more capable than we assumed. There is something deeply human in that possibility. We know from our own lives how easily memory can thin. A language fades if no one speaks it. A skill disappears if no one teaches it. A family story changes with each retelling until only the emotion survives. On the scale of civilizations, that same process becomes almost unimaginable in size. Entire ways of knowing can vanish, leaving behind only stubborn, material clues. And those clues ask something difficult of us. They ask us to treat history not as a ladder, but as a landscape, one marked by peaks, disappearances, detours, and returns. They ask us to honor both evidence and silence, to understand that what is missing may matter as much as what remains. Because perhaps the most haunting thought is not that ancient people knew impossible things. It is that they may have known perfectly possible things beautifully and deeply, and that the world simply forgot how to remember them. And so we arrive at the threshold where mystery changes its shape. At first, these objects seem to challenge chronology. They appeared to stand in defiance of the timelines we had inherited, like stones dropped into still water. But after walking among them through wreckage, tombs, workshops, maps, lenses, metals, and fragments, their deeper message begins to feel less confrontational and more reflective. They do not simply ask whether history is wrong. They ask what kind of story history has been trying to tell. For a long time, the dominant story favored continuity, improvement, and clean succession. One era hands its torch to the next. Knowledge accumulates. Civilization advances. There is truth in that narrative, of course, but it is incomplete. It leaves little room for collapse, interruption, forgetting, or the quiet brilliance that flourishes far from imperial centers and official archives. It underestimates how often human achievement survives only in pieces. That is why these artifacts stay with us. They restore texture to the past. They remind us that earlier worlds were not merely waiting to become modern. They were alive with experimentation, discipline, imagination, and forms of mastery adapted to their own conditions. Some of those achievements entered the stream of recorded memory. Others fell out of it. What remains are clues, sometimes clear, sometimes ambiguous, always shaped by the accidents of survival. There is a kind of dignity in accepting that ambiguity, not because we should stop searching, but because the search itself becomes richer when it is guided by humility. The most honest encounter with the past is not conquest, it is listening. Listening to objects, to context, to silence, to the possibility that what looks anomalous may actually be a fragment of a larger human pattern we are only beginning to understand. And if that is true, then these impossible objects are not really about impossibility at all. They are about continuity after loss, about intelligence without applause, about the scattered evidence that human beings in every age have reached farther than the record can fully hold, and trusted the future to notice someday that they were here. In the end, the most enduring mystery is not whether an object was found in the wrong time period. It is whether time itself has ever been as orderly as we wanted to believe. We began with artifacts that seemed to arrive out of sequence. Machines before machines, precision before precision, insight before its appointed century. Each one invited a familiar temptation, to force the past into a revelation dramatic enough to satisfy modern hunger. But the closer we looked, the more the story softened into something wiser. These objects were not demanding spectacle. They were asking for patience. What they reveal, above all, is the unstable nature of memory. Civilizations remember selectively. They preserve monuments and lose methods. They archive names and forget processes. They celebrate empires while overlooking the anonymous craft, quiet experimentation, and practical genius that make a culture livable. Sometimes a single surviving object bears the weight of an entire vanished tradition, not because it is supernatural, but because it is lonely. That loneliness reaches toward us. A gear encrusted with salt, a line on a map, a polished stone, a curve of glass, a sealed vessel, a buried tool. These are modest things, and yet they endure with astonishing force because they carry more than material history. They carry the emotional truth that human beings have always been searching, measuring, building, imagining, trying to leave behind something sturdy enough to outlast forgetting. Perhaps that is why such objects move us so deeply. We recognize ourselves in them. Our own age, too, is full of fragile brilliance. Our tools are more complex, our archives more vast, but we are not exempt from disappearance. We also live by knowledge that can be broken, neglected, or lost. So maybe the final question is not what impossible objects say about the past. Maybe it is what they ask of the future. What will remain of us, and who will one day hold it in their hands, wondering how a people so inventive could have left behind so much and still vanished into silence.